Well, hello, everyone. I see that we have quite a few people in the room. I'm Kalyani Grasso, and I'm with the Siebert Lutheran Foundation. I'm a program officer, and we've got Mike Ward here. I'm just going to start off with just a few housekeeping announcements. You probably heard this if you were in the keynote presentation right before this. As you can see, the sessions are being recorded. They will be shared with you about 2 weeks after the conference. You can find any presentations or reference materials on the landing page for the session. And then you probably are aware that with Zoom webinar, there's a Q&A box where you can send in questions for the speaker. So that's where we would ask you to send in any questions that you have during the webinar is fine. Mike said he loves answering questions. He's got a fairly loose style, so feel free to interact via the Q&A. Feel free also to use the chat in the Zoom to share any comments or talk to your fellow attendees, but make sure that you ask your questions in the Q&A box. So with that, I am gonna hand it over to Mike.
Very good. Well, I'm excited to be with everybody today, and I am gonna, ask that. Hold on, I was trying to share my screen. I'm gonna try that again. All right, so I will be sharing my screen. And I'm going to invite people to go ahead and use the Q&A now, and just let us know what questions do you have about stewardship now, in particular, in light of the pandemic that we've been through. Just know I can't see anybody in this presentation format, so I will assume everybody's paying attention, but it's a whole lot easier for me to know you're paying attention if questions will come up, or if you'll use the chat box and let me know things. And so I'm happy to be interrupted during the time and go to your questions. I know I'm not going to get through every slide today. I always tend to create more presentation than I'll have time for. But I want to be as relevant as I can be. And so I encourage you, use the Q&A, use the chat more just to let me know you're still paying attention. Q&A if you actually have a question that you want the presentation to be interrupted for, and I'll try and make sure too that I pause at the end to make sure that we get time for questions if they haven't come up before. I do want to spend a minute or two at the beginning just to talk about what the pandemic may have changed, or what it is exactly that we're seeing. And just for those of you that don't know me, I work across the country with congregations and other faith-based organizations, primarily in the area of fundraising. Our firm, I think, is currently working with about 250 congregations in annual stewardship work, in addition to campaigns and other things. And we have, in fact, done capital campaigns in congregations during the pandemic, even at times when they were not meeting in person at all. And I'll tell you, honestly, they've been some of the most successful campaigns I've been part of. The average gift that we had in one debt reduction campaign exceeded anything we had ever seen before. They maintained over a $20,000 average gift through the first 42 gifts, and this was debt reduction, and I've just never seen that before. It was a tremendous, tremendous response. And so that's one of the things we're seeing. The 50% of people who have remained highly engaged in their congregations, their level of generosity is certainly exceeding pre-pandemic levels. We're attributing that to a couple of things. First, we're seeing that the congregation has been incredibly relevant in their life during the pandemic. It is what is, keeping their faith strong, has been what, has really sustained them. For those of you that work with organizations, not congregations, they see you making a difference in people's lives, even in the midst of the pandemic. That generosity is happening not to save organizations, but to help organizations live into their mission even better. So we're seeing, from the 50% who are still highly engaged, we're seeing much more generosity, and savings rate in America, stock market valuations certainly help with that. And congregationally, we are seeing what we call missing donors, people who gave in 2019, but they failed to give in 2020 or 2021, and sometimes gave in 2020, but not yet in 2021. Some people certainly have taken the pandemic as the time to say. Others still care. They're just not as engaged, and their giving habit was to give when they were in person, and they're not in person sometimes, and so they're not giving like they did. Or have had many people tell me, they give when they're in person, but when they miss 10 weeks, it's hard to write that bigger check. And so that missing donors, it's a critical group to be engaged with. And whether you're an institution or a congregation, we need to step up the way in which we communicate with those lapsed donors, not just for their money, but just to care for them. So I'm highly encouraging care calls and that sort of thing. I will say one of the things that that's really been highlighted during the pandemic is we would call poor storytelling. That the storytelling of the ministry is focused upon how hard it is to do ministry during the pandemic. And don't get me wrong, I know it's hard to do ministry during the pandemic, but our story really needs to be focused on what's God up to in the midst of all this. People are looking for that story of hope. They're not looking for something that causes them to feel more tired. And so the story of what God's up to, the story is to the impact of the ministry, and taking the time to discern that and not just jumping to the next thing that we have to do. We are seeing losses of significant donors in some cases where they've either died, or it does seem to be a lot of moving happening these days, people moving closer to family, those kinds of things. But that's also, there's a positive on the other side of that if people are moving into your community. And certainly we're seeing the need to increase technological capacity for soliciting and receiving gifts and utilizing that technology for telling your story. A blog function to have your stories out there, clicking a link to make a gift, QR codes. I used to think they were very innovative, but nobody would use them. And now people are using them because restaurants require them, basically. And so people have been trained to use technology in new ways. And we need to make sure we're capturing that in the church. Prior to launching any virtual worship service, I would send an email that gives people the option as to where they can click to make their gift. Even during the service, flashing a QR code on the screen, making sure people know where on your website they can make a gift is just critical. Those are critical tasks now in the church, and we need to be paying attention to those. So that's primarily what we've seen. Did any questions come in early that I need to focus on? All right, so I am going to assume you're paying attention and you're interested in the topic at hand. So again, feel free, if you've got questions about any of this that you want to make sure I cover before the end, get those in. Use the chat, feel free to say hi. Let me know you're there and you're not just, sitting outside in the sun with your screen on so you get credit for being part of a webinar. So quickly, one of my goals for our time together is moving from a scarcity mindedness in congregation culture to one that embraces abundance. And I believe that abundance is recognizing the one that provides us everything and recognizing it's not only enough, but it's enough to share. Sometimes when we talk abundance, people start thinking that it's just for wealthy folks. Abundance is more of a mindset. And honestly, in the United States, I see abundance mentality probably better from our middle class, lower middle class folks. They've recognized that they have enough and they can share it. Upper middle class, upper class folks tend to want to accumulate more. Those are broad stereotypes. I try not to deal in them. But abundance is not a condition of wealth. It's a condition of recognizing God is the provider and that God has provided enough and it's enough to share. Cannot overstate enough the need to be storytellers when we're looking at stewardship and fundraising. And there's 4 stories that I want us to think about. The biblical story, I ask people, what's the biblical basis for why you do stewardship? And inevitably somebody will talk about the tithing passages of the Old Testament. Others, will simply point to the resurrection. We need to know where it is biblically that we ground our stewardship understanding and ideas. And there's not a right and a wrong here. I tend not to go to the tithing passages because fewer than 10% of American Protestants tithe, 10% or more. In fact, the majority of Protestants are giving much less than 1% of their income. I don't think it's helpful. And so I just don't go there. I think going to the creation story is a fine place to start. That ties into theologically using the first article of the creed. Where I tend to go is Matthew 6:21, where your treasure is, your heart will be also. Those are Jesus's words. So grounding stewardship is a matter of the heart. That's what we're about when we're encouraging people to give more money. It's not because we need to pay the bills. It's because we're trying to help their spiritual life and try to get them better connected to the church. I think a lot of people need a little further on in Matthew 6 need to embrace the concept that we don't need to worry about tomorrow, that tomorrow has worries of its own. I see so much fear in that holds our donors back from living a full life and being more generous. And so we just need to know how it is we come to stewardship from a biblical perspective. It is not paying the bills. We do not do stewardship so we can keep the lights on in the church. God doesn't need us to keep our lights on. God needs us to touch people's lives, to advance the kingdom, to share the mission. Then we need to capture outcome stories. I have this silly habit of reading other people's newsletters and bulletins and seeing, what's God up to in this place? And oftentimes it's a lack of help for the Altar Guild and for other committees. And it's a story that expenses exceeded revenue last week. That's not the story of what God's up to. Others, we throw all these programs and opportunities at people that ask them to come to things, ask them to give to things, ask them to do things, but they don't tell stories of what God ever did in those things. What we need to get at is the story of what God's up to. Good stewardship isn't like some tricky little fundraising thing. Good stewardship is telling people what God's up to and inviting people into that story. Henri Nouwen talks about, fundraising is about inviting people to share in your mission with you. And outcome stories are the ways in which we draw people in. And I tell you what, in the midst of the pandemic and all the negative news that we get, if you start telling outcome stories and telling stories of what God is up to, people are going to pay attention to you far more than they're going to be paying attention to anything else out there. I heard it again. Somebody said, we just have to tell people more about what we do. And I said, actually, no, you need to tell people a better story. You need to let people know the outcome of what God's up to. You don't need to start doing Twitter, messaging in addition to your other things. They're ignoring you already because they're bored by the message. What people need is to be brought into the outcome of what God is doing. Generosity stories are critical, especially in today's world, because inevitably somebody will say, well, we're in a pandemic, people can't give. And the opposite is true. But when we're not telling stories of people being generous, the scarcity story can overtake it. And so the generosity story is the one that says, hey, I got this stimulus check and I don't need it, so I'm giving it to the church because I want something, I want some good to come out of it. Or next year I'm going to grow my giving by $20 a week because I'm sure I waste that amount, and instead of wasting it next year, I'm going to give that money away. So generosity stories lead other people to be generous because nobody wants to be the only generous person in your congregation. And I also very much believe that generosity is a learned behavior, and we don't talk about money in the church, and therefore most people in our society don't ever get a chance to learn generosity from generous people. And so we've got to be telling those stories. And I don't usually like to hear stories of this is how much money I give away. I like to hear stories of the struggle, but the ways in which we're growing in our generosity, because that's what people can relate to. And then finally, it's our own story with money. How do we relate to money? Is it a tool to do good? Is it a means of security? Is it something we've never had enough of, and we're always worried about where the next paycheck is coming from? Or do we see it as something that we have plenty of and it's just money and we can give it away? We need to know how we relate to money so that we can begin to understand how others relate to money so that we can begin to help them to be more generous. So those are the stories we need to know. I could do 3 hours on each of these topics, and we don't have time for that. But did I see any questions come in, or
Yeah.
what do we got?
So there's a question about how do you get people who haven't given for a long time to give again?
That's a great question, and trial and error, honestly. We've got to try some things. Actually, we've got to figure out what will draw them in. I truly believe it's those outcome stories that's going to draw them in. Not just, telling them to come back to faith formation or telling them to come back to worship or inviting them to serve on a committee. I believe that once they recognize God is up to something in the ministry, that will attract them. The other thing I want to do with people is just care for them. Truly, not talking about money at all, but simply to call and check in. The money is an indicator that their heart is moving away from the ministry. If the money's gone away, at least if Jesus is right in Matthew 6:21, where your treasure is, your heart is, we've begun to lose some of their heart. So I think it's incumbent upon us that our first contact with people isn't about renewing a gift. Our first contact with people is, how's it going for you in the midst of this? We haven't seen you lately, right? We miss you, we care for you. I had one client last year, this was in Chicago, so similar client to what most of you all live in, who in November, they did do a visit to the households of people who had not turned in a pledge card. And the people that made those visits were trained not to focus on attaining a pledge card, but they were people that needed to be cared for by the congregation and reconnected, but also needed to be reconnected in a way that didn't feel like we were just asking them for stuff, whether it was money or time or whatever, but it was to tell them a story of what God's been up to in the ministry since they were last there, to ask how we can pray for them, to ask how they can be cared for. So we really start with the relationship and then try to bring them into the story again before we start asking again. I hadn't necessarily planned to do this, but a colleague of mine, she talks in terms of, we need to be making enough deposits into people's lives so that when we're ready to ask for something, there's something there to be withdrawn, okay? That too much, if you analyze a lot of the newsletters, bulletins of congregations, they're simply asking people for things, right? Serve on this committee, give to this effort, come to this event. It's asking. It's all withdrawal language. We're asking people to give up something, their money, their time, their energy. And what we need to be doing is making deposits into their life so that they'll want to do those things. And we need to be making more deposits than withdrawals. And I believe that the stories that I've got up on the screen right now, the biblical story, the outcome story, the generosity story, those lead to deposits in people's lives. They need to know God's up to something before we can get them back to something else. How do you renew their gift? Ultimately, it's going to be a little bit harder than just renewing somebody that's been giving regularly. So ultimately, you probably need to personalize it a little bit more, maybe make a phone call asking. But again, I would do it out of a sense of relationship before I'm just trying to get their money again. We need to put those deposits back in their life, which is the care, it's the connection, it's the finding out what's going on in their life first. And then once that has happened, we're ready to make an ask again. Is there another question, or was that our only one?
Yeah, there's a question which I'm just going to read out here. I'm in a underserved area with many first-generation immigrants who are just starting to make money. My struggle is communicating generosity to folks who've been so turned off by other pastors or politicians here and back home that they perceive us as all about money, especially as I'm working across various cultures. Also, I'm coming from a middle upper class background and I'm communicating with folks who have experienced hardship, poverty, and poverty. I realize this might not apply to everyone in the group, but I'm interested in some wisdom here.
I'll give you what I got and you can decide later if it's wisdom or not. But certainly it sounds like you understand your own relationship with money and where you approach it versus the folks you're serving amongst, which is really important. As we look at generosity stories, certainly your generosity stories are going to be okay, but aren't going to necessarily relate as much to someone who is, many first generation immigrants tend to be paycheck to paycheck for a while, at least until they get established. Accumulated wealth isn't necessarily a thing, that generational wealth. So a couple things. I would let them tell each other, and this is probably true across contexts, let your people tell their generosity stories to stimulate the generosity of one another, okay? Top-down demands for money is what televangelists do, and the people that have burned the church, over the years tend to do. Just turn your TV on at night and you can find those folks. And so instead of it being paid church leadership telling congregation give money, let it be peer-to-peer. And in the fundraising world, the best fundraising that happens is peer-to-peer fundraising. It is somebody asking a friend and saying, I love this organization. This is what they're doing. I invite you to join me in making a gift. What those people that have burned in the church before have done is it's never been a join me culture. It's been a hey you culture. And what we need to do, I think across contexts, honestly, is to create that join me culture. And so as church staff, if you're asking somebody to give to something, you really need to have given to it yourself, but better yet, have the folks do it with one another. The context you're describing tends to be a context in which I would never talk about yearly gift amounts. I wouldn't even talk about monthly gift amounts. I would talk about weekly giving. The ways in which folks in that context that you're describing can make significant gifts is through the cumulative value of a gift over time, right? And many of them are paid weekly, and therefore talking about a weekly gift is much more relevant. $20 a week is actually $1,000 gift. Don't talk about giving $1,000. Invite that $20 a week commitment, and invite, and again, join me culture peer-to-peer, and somebody amongst that culture saying, I couldn't write a check for $1,000, but I can give $20 a week and I'm excited to do so. So I think those are my first thoughts. I hope that's helpful. Anything else, or shall I move on?
Nothing else right now.
Okay. And to the two that said hi in the chat box, I'm so excited to know that at least 15 minutes ago you were paying attention. So that's delightful. If you're following along with the slide presentation that's loaded, I just skipped a few because I did it verbally. And so that's kind of where we are. So once upon a time, I went to church in my own congregation in the morning, and I was driving to another place on Sunday afternoon, and I thought back to the announcement period of time, and I remembered that one of those announcements went something along the lines of, the Altar Guild needs help. Wouldn't you like to help? If you would, contact Peggy after the service. All right. Maybe they said something about what the Altar Guild actually did. When the phrase, wouldn't you like to help, came about, I said to myself, heck no, I wouldn't really like to help, because my experience as the altar guild was those mean old ladies that when I was in the 7th grade and I was an acolyte, they told me that God didn't show up that Sunday because I accidentally lit the candle on the right before the one on the left, right? That was a big thing in my congregation growing up. And so I remember I totally did not connect to this announcement. And in fact, I think I pretty well tuned it out and then tuned out everything that followed because I was so unengaged into this. Shortly after that happened, I came across a friend of mine who basically said serving on Altar Guild was the most spiritually enriching month of her year. And her story is up on the screen now. I'll let you all read it. But and I was like, how in the world is serving on the Altar Guild the most spiritually enriching month of your year? And she went on to share this. And as I started to make connections, like this is the outcome story. This is why we want somebody to serve on Altar Guild. You know, we've made so many things about the task that we've forgotten the underlying purpose. We don't have people volunteer for Altar Guild because we're too cheap to pay somebody to do it. We do it because it's an opportunity for service. It's an opportunity to connect your spiritual life to an activity. And by the way, this person, when she told me this, was in her 40s. I mean, it wasn't the mean old ladies that, anyway. And so, but why don't we recruit with this story? That if you'd like a more spiritually enriching year in your life, Altar Guild's the place to do it, because you can set the table on Friday afternoons and your prayer life can just soar. I had a guy that ushers tell me that, you know, thank God for ushering, because it's only because of that he met his best friend, and he's got a deep relationship with another person in the faith community, because if he wasn't ushering, he wouldn't have been welcoming, because he kind of feels obligated to do it when he's an usher. And so we've got to discover the purpose and tell the outcome of what we do, and not just what it sounds like we typically do is we're just begging people to do things. In fact, back to that deposit withdrawal language, we're taking these withdrawals from people because we're just asking them to do one more thing. But instead, if we can share the story of outcome, we're making a deposit in their life, even if they don't want to serve on Altar Guild. People are like, well, wow, it's really exciting that the people I know and care about in this congregation are being spiritually fed by the things they're doing. Like, that's the outcome of why we exist. Not the story that there's just not enough people to do stuff here. Or I hate it when I hear, well, it's the same 10% of people doing all the work. Well, it's because a lot of people just don't want to be busier. And all we're doing is giving them busy work. Let's give them meaningful things to engage in that advance the mission of the church and develop spirituality and faith practice and the other things that align with our mission and what we're about. So anyway, someday I hope that the announcement goes, there's only one spot remaining on the Altar Guild, and this opportunity may not come around again for a couple of years. So if you'd like this opportunity, you better act fast. I can't wait till I hear the congregation that gets to market that way. So we do have a model for how we encourage the sharing of outcome stories. And my colleague Mitzi is the one that has really developed this model, and she does trainings across the country on outcome storytelling. This may be a topic for a future Siebert conference to have, but she calls it the Saga Model, but it's Saga with a C instead of with an S. And so the first thing you describe is the change, then what was the agent of that change, the gifts that made it happen, and the ask for another gift. You know, a lot of times we hear, we're paying the overhead of the church, or I saw one of the people I'm working with this year showed me a graph of where their money goes, and like 94% of money went into governance and administration. And I was like, no way. They failed to articulate that like leading worship wasn't governance and administration, but that was actually like worship, and teaching a class, the paid person that did that was actually faith formation, not administration. So what we need to be able to articulate is the change that's happening in people's lives. So back to the Altar Guild example, the change that happened in Stephanie's life was, I had the most spiritual month of my year. What caused that to happen was the ministry of the church through the Altar Guild, right? The gift that made it happen, in this case, it's really that we sustain worship, and that continues to happen. Oftentimes the gift that makes ministry happen in the church is, the annual fund offering that pays the staff person to be part of something, or the facility care gift that allows the lights to be on. Lights aren't overhead, lights are on because they allow ministry to happen within the space. And then the final piece of the acronym there is the ask for another gift. And you don't always have to do that ask for another gift. Sometimes we just let people know that a change happened, that the agent of change was the ministry here at the church. Your gifts made it happen, and then we just kind of leave it there because we don't want people to think we're asking all the time. So the key is to discern the change. Too often in outcome storytelling, what people will try to do is tell every story that comes up. Like, you don't have to tell every story that comes up. It's okay to focus on a single story. It's okay to go deeper down a road. And so, and I guess people ask me all the time, well, where do you find these? Well, you have to talk to people. And I would start with my counsel. I'd say, what's God been up to over the last month? And discern, what changes have happened. Not just that we had the men's breakfast, but what difference did it make to anybody that showed up to the men's breakfast? What change happened in their life because they were part of that? A friendship deepened, that a contact was made, that they had a friend to lean on during a tough time in their life, or whatever it is. We need to discern down to the change, and it's not our normal language in the church anymore. Our normal language in the church right now is telling people what we do. We celebrate how busy we are. We move from one thing to the next to the next. We want to show an active church. I personally don't care about active churches. I care about churches that are making a difference in the lives of their members and the lives of the communities they serve. And we need to focus on the difference that's being made. So discerning down to that change is really the critical piece. So if you have questions about that, get them flowing in. I'm going to move a little bit to generosity stories now. I gave you a couple of these, but these are all samples of how you share generosity. Don't make it a surprise at the end of a campaign. You need to give generosity stories so other people can discern how they can be generous, and so that they can know they're not going to be the only generous person. I think council's giving first, even in an annual fund appeal, is best practice, so that people know that whatever your goal is, the council is helping you get there. And generosity stories assure people that they won't be the only generous person to your cause. And it helps teach people how to be generous. And it gives people confidence you're going to achieve a goal. And I mean, I could go deeper into each of those pieces, but ultimately, people want you to be successful. People want to do their part, and people want to discern how it is they might be able to be more generous to something. So, what I get from folks on this a lot is, well, giving's a secret in our church. Nobody's allowed to know what people give. So how would I find these stories? And my first answer to that is, well, you change it. There's really no place for secrecy in a church. There's a great place for confidentiality. I think pastors are pretty good with confidentiality. They can know. I think a small team of stewardship people should be able to know. But we can't lead people to be more generous until we're able to tell these stories. And so then we listen for them. We listen for people to talk about how it is you're struggling with generosity, how you're finding ways to be more generous. We can look at numbers. If you look in your pledge results for this year and you see that somebody doubled their giving, call them and thank them, and then say, tell me why you did that, because it's something I'd love to teach other people. And nobody will shy away from wanting to tell you that story. Start telling your own story of generosity, and particular, if you can share a story of struggle, others will relate to it and others will engage you in that conversation. We need to get past the place where this feels like a taboo topic. Because, and by the way, that secrecy mentality in a church leaves stewardship and generosity to feeling like it's a financial transaction, because there's no personal witness, there's no personal story embedded into it. And I'll give you Nouwen's quote on that, because he was a spiritual guru talking about fundraising, which is just really fun. So I'll just leave that on the screen for you to read. Any questions pop up that we need to pause for?
None right now.
All right, I'll just keep going through. So understanding our own story with money. Nouwen says we will never be able to ask for money if we don't know how we ourselves relate to money. You know, did you have, I grew up in a family that never talked about money. That was a topic we didn't have. I assumed my family to be generous because I saw the envelope, the giving envelope on the table every Saturday night before Sunday worship. So I knew they gave something, but I had no idea what exactly it was or how to make a giving decision. Figure out if we're generous. We don't know if we're generous or not until culture starts talking about it. Nouwen says money has something to do with that intimate place in our heart where we need security, and we don't want to reveal our need or give away security to someone who maybe only accidentally might betray us. And there has been betrayal around money. You know, I worked with a congregation that was like, well, we can't let our pastor know because like 48 years ago, a pastor misused, you know, some of that information and was treating some people better than other people because of it. And my only response was, we can't live 48 years ago anymore. Like, we can't afford to do that moving forward. And your current pastor is not that pastor. And there's got to be, you know, forgiveness and reconciliation in our world that can move us forward around this topic. And then we need to be careful that we don't use that to betray people or hurt people. I actually believe by not knowing what people give, we hurt more people, because we tell people, you know, we need $300,000 this year. And you've got people thinking, well, what difference does my gift make? I don't have enough. I'm not worthy. I think not knowing causes shame because we can't personalize the experience. I also think that I just lost my thought. I'll come back to it. And I think I might be coming back to it right here. So this chart on your screen is a typical chart for giving in a congregation. The amounts on the left side are your weekly giving amounts, and then the bar shows you how many people in that category are giving at that level. Typical congregation, fewer people at the top, very few people in the middle, and a big bottom portion to your project or to your giving. Most of the people in your $30 a week and less giving amounts don't pledge. The difference in generosity in for most people has very little to do with wealth. It has far more to do with intentionality. And so these people $30 a week and less are not being very intentional. They're not, you know, they're not giving on that weekly basis, so they're not able to make that more substantial gift. If your giving was gifted according to wealth, you'd have a huge middle, few people on top, few people on bottom, and that's not what we see. And so I think this spread of gifts is a result of not talking about money and not knowing who gives what, because we can't address people as the individuals that they are to help people grow from where they are. What ends up happening then is people stagnate and they convince themselves they don't have enough, so they're just not going to give any more away. I truly believe that from all the work I've done across the church. So how do we understand this scarcity mentality? There's a book called Passing the Plate, which was a sociological study of giving that found these 8 things to be the keys as to why people don't give. Some people feel an inability to give more. They actually can give more. They just feel an inability to do so. That's the lack of generosity storytelling. not feeling the church needs more money, that's a lack of a strategic plan and a vision from the congregation. And a lack of telling outcome stories and inviting people to make another gift. There's an ignorance of a need, and sometimes that's on the person and sometimes that's on the church. Just because we tell somebody doesn't mean they've absorbed it in a way that is meaningful. And so we've got to work on that. There are places where the council and staff are not trusted to make good decisions. Low expectations of donors is a big one. If I don't give a gift next month to a camp I support, they're going to call me and ask me what's going on in my life. All right. If I don't give my gift to my congregation next month, nobody will call. Okay. Both are on automatic giving from me. Both have come to expect it, and I've got relationships with both. And there's a low expectation of me from my congregation. They would not call. They would find that intrusive. If I don't give next month, something's going on in my life, and somebody should be checking on me. All right. So anyway, there is a feeling that other people aren't generous. Those donors at the top of the giving chart that I just showed you, most of them can afford to give more, but they've done the math in their head. If I'm giving $12,000 a year and we have 100 giving families, why is our budget not 1.2 million? Why is our budget only $300,000? It's because other people aren't giving like I am. Or what often happens, especially in secrecy congregations, I increased my gift last year, and here it is March, and they're telling me already that we're behind in budget, right? So all I'm left when that's the only story to know is that, well, I increased my giving, but it didn't matter because everybody else must have decreased theirs. When in reality, one of your largest donors either died or moved away and has caused the problem, but we don't tell that whole story. So it is a problem for people to, and without telling generosity stories, people aren't going to know that other people are generous. I think I've talked about secrecy, and I've talked about occasional donors already as well. So our current reality, the median Protestant, if you line us up by a giving percentage of our income, the one in the middle is the median. That person is giving 0.62% of their income to the church. They are only giving away 0.9% of their income in total. So the good news is most of their generosity is coming to the church. The bad news is it's far less than 1% of their income, which is, again, the main reason why I won't talk about tithing. Most congregations, the largest giving category is for people giving $5 a week or less. That is less than $1 a day, by the way. And in most congregations, it's not a condition of wealth. Most people can afford to increase their giving by $1 a day next year. They've just never been asked in that way or to think about it. Now, I don't want us to do a campaign that everybody grows by $1 a day, but it might not be the worst thing that happens in some of our congregations. I started this with a biblical understanding of giving. We don't have really good theological and biblical language around giving. Sometimes it's legalistic and you should tithe. Well, that's not working. Like, people aren't relating to that. So we need to discover and uncover what is the theological reason. Can we develop better understanding in our people of Luther's understanding of the first article of the creed? Or what biblical texts do we go to undergird why we should be generous? And so many congregations, it's about paying the bills. I've got enough bills at my own house. I don't need to worry about other people's bills, but I will worry about making an impact in the world. And that's what we need to be inviting people into. We need more accountability. The second bullet, I think, may be one of the most important. We have no vision of what we would do with extra money. In so many of our churches, it is make your gifts in October so that in November we can figure out what the budget's going to look like. Okay. You're asking people to give to something you don't know what it is. And there may be a way to justify that theologically or biblically, that because yes, people should give a percentage of their income. They should be generous according to their means. They should. But the reality is people give where they know there is need and where there is impact. And so we will come out far better to say, hey, our leadership has discerned a vision that we need an extra $1,000 a week next year so that we can do this ministry. And here's the impact we expect. So we invite you to consider your increase in generosity next year towards that. All right. And then another trend we're seeing, this was pre-pandemic, but we're seeing a trend that we don't articulate the value of worship in people's lives. In fact, I hear people often say, well, they only come to worship, so what, they're not very involved in our church. Well, I actually think there's a lot to be said for what happens in worship. We've lost language around the importance of faith formation. We tend to raise money around social service stuff, and I think it's because it's so tangible. Or we raise money around facility issues. I think there's a lot more money to be raised around worship and care and faith formation if we would better tell those stories. Better tell the stories of the impact that care had when my dad died, or when my daughter's best friend was killed in a car accident. Instead of, anyway, we need to recover that. And then it's been proven that when the majority of money stays in the local congregation, people will give less, because the vision is limited. People give less to limited vision. When you're not supporting, your synod and your district and your national church, and you're not supporting organizations outside your own walls, when the majority of money is just to pay the bills, people are uninspired by that. It's been proven over and over again that when you have major outreach partners, giving will go up to operations and the outreach, because you're doing more. We do a lot of campaigns, whether it's for like a synod or a camp or a social service organization. And when we come in and do that in a congregation, we've never had it where giving to the congregation went down so that they could give more to the outside organization. The opposite is true. The outside organization gets cared for very nicely, and giving goes up to the congregation because people see the ministry doing something different and having a bigger impact in doing more. So we tend, as good of intention as we are, we often will stifle generosity. We publish a box score. How much money did we not get in last week that we needed? Like, I hate the box score of expenses versus revenue. It doesn't tell a story. It's just a financial transaction. Doesn't tell us that anything for the kingdom of God happened because of the giving. We tend to treat everybody the same, and we treat everybody, on that chart I showed you, we treat everybody as if they're at the upper end of that giving category. We have a question that we will ask on that chart that says, where would I be if I doubled my giving? And inevitably somebody says, take that question off because our people can't do that. Well, the people that are currently giving $10,000 a year probably can't do that, but the person currently giving $300 a year very likely could. In fact, many times the people giving $5,000 a year could actually double their giving. So treating everybody the same is not a good thing. Don't treat anybody better than anyone else, but it's fine to treat people different because we're different people. We're at different places in our generosity journey. If you've said good news, we're keeping the budget flat, that's actually bad news, because what you're telling your donors is there's no need for them to give any more money next year. So I had a congregation once tell me they couldn't grow their giving because all their people were on a fixed income. I had a conversation with somebody that was on that stewardship team, and I said, I'm guessing you're on a fixed income. And he's like, yeah. And I said, I'm guessing you haven't kept your giving flat over the last 6 years, because I knew this person and I knew what else they gave to. And he said, no. I said, well, what percentage has your giving increased over the last 6 years? And he said, I'll get back to you. He had doubled his income in 6 years on a fixed income. And I said, well, guess what? Guess who's telling a generosity story next week? Because the excuse was we can't do something because, well, it was simply an excuse. It wasn't a reason. There is a big difference in that. And if your congregation has too much money in savings, people will stop giving. So if you got a PPP loan and haven't spent it, I know legally, technically you have spent it, but you just offset it with other money that still came in. You need to deploy that money for something, because we are nonprofits and we should fully embrace that nonprofit mentality. I'm good if you have a little bit, maybe 2 months of savings so that you don't have to do short-term borrowing, but we don't need to have money in savings that doesn't have a name on it. So anyway, I'm going to skip that one. This comes straight from that book, Passing the Plate. These are the factors in low giving, non-giving. I think I've covered all of them so far. By the way, I'm about to come to the point where the program is dependent upon your questions, so be getting those in. or else it'll be an awkward silence. So I think the keys to a culture of generosity, I did write a book, Abundance, Creating a Culture of Generosity, published by Fortress Press. If you're, everything I've talked about today, much more detail in there, but it's about leadership, it's about the stewardship program, and it's about the strategic plan. And the stewardship program is built far more on inspiration than it is on information. And I've gotten to that through outcome stories and some other things today, but those are, in my opinion, those are the three building blocks from where we start: leadership, stewardship program, and then your strategic plan. And by the way, strategic plans are not evil things that the business world is trying to impose upon the churchy nonprofit world. Strategic planning, as long as you get the identity right for who you are as a congregation or other ministry organization, strategic plan will be just fine for you, because it's not going to ask you to become somebody you're not. It's going to ask you to declare your identity and to live into that as best as you possibly can. So I would say let's model some generosity. You know, different ways of doing that are here on your screen. I was mentored by a woman named Virginia. Her husband, Bob, had already passed away when I met her. But she told me that when they were first starting out, they couldn't tithe 10%, and they thought they should. And so they made a covenant with one another to grow their giving by 1% a year and never quit. And when Bob died, they were given 38% of their income away. I didn't know that was even allowed. You know, but she talked about the joy she had in being part of so much ministry going on in the world, that it was just a huge deal for her. So I haven't quite caught Virginia yet, but I do keep Virginia in my head as I make generosity decisions in my life. So here's what I'd like you to do. This is kind of where you've really arrived, and we'll be doing everything and moving it ahead. You know, tell those outcome and generous stories. Have your students. When you do ask people, inspire them. Do that before you ask. If you don't inspire somebody, if you only inform and ask without inspiration, people think you just wanted their money. And so we've got to make sure that inspiration gets in there. Be sure to be grateful. Yeah. And the model stewardship drive, it's about informing. It's about motivating. Asking, I like to ask for a specific amount. I think that's how we get shame out of the process. And then thank people. Actually be grateful. And by the way, that earlier question about those that have been burned by other pastors or whatever, gratitude can go a long way to help cover that up. Gratitude is both thankfulness, but it's also accountability. You know, we told you last year we would like additional gifts so that we could do better pastoral care. Let me tell you how we're doing better pastoral care now. Or we asked for more gifts to improve the youth ministry. Let me tell you how we're doing that improved youth ministry and the impact it's had on people's lives. If you start doing that, people will no longer associate you with the culture or with those bad things. But until we start doing them, people will be skeptical, and maybe even rightfully so. And so even though those aren't our sins, we're still paying for them anyway. And we need to overcome them. So gratitude can really go a long way in smoothing some of that out. So anyway, I think we got about 6 minutes. Is that close?
Yeah, sounds about right.
Right. So I actually did cover the slides, so I apologize for all that information, but questions?
I don't see a question, but if I may ask a question that has been asked this past year, in the keynote, the presenters mentioned that 75 to 80% of church attendance has decreased. So there's much fewer people in the pews. And so I was wondering, how do you reach people who just don't show up, who aren't there physically?
So wonderful question. I don't think there's a singular formula, but I will tell you, I think where I started with the stories, especially the outcome stories. I think a lot of people don't know what's missing in their life because of that loss of language around the importance of worship and faith formation and care and those kinds of things. And it was a habit that could be broken because we didn't have the stories surrounding us as to what that was. And so I think if we're trying to reach people that used to be amongst us and they're not now, how about getting the stories of the difference it's making in the people's lives who have come back, and then find ways to get those stories in front of the people who haven't. We typically recommend twice a month. So we love opt-in email stuff, so that if I'm not interested in women's programming in a church, I don't get the announcements about women's programming. It doesn't clutter my inbox. I don't have to sift through it and find it. So what we like to do is have people opt into the messages they get, but there's not an opt-in category for getting our outcome stories. And they get pushed out twice a month on the same day each month, so that people start getting used to the first and third Thursday being a day when they're going to get a story that's going to touch their lives. And those stories, I mean, certainly email push is one way to get them there as a written form, recorded and posted on your Facebook page. You know, when we do that, the number of likes, the number of shares skyrocket versus much of what is posted on Facebook stuff, because it's just billboard announcement asking people for stuff. It's withdrawal language instead of a deposit. And then it's the personal touch, like, you know, phone calls go a long way. Personal notes and cards go a long way. Showing up in somebody's living room and having a conversation to discover what's going on in their life and missing goes a long way. I had a pastor do open office hours on Zoom and had people that were disconnected from the church show up and say, well, that was totally worth it because I made that new connection. Or just announcing that, you know, you're going to do office hours at Starbucks or the, you know, the brewery or wherever, and invite people to engage it, you know, but it just telling people what you're doing isn't going to change their behavior. Telling people why you're doing it, the difference it's making in people's lives will lead to that change in behavior. I think that's what I got.
Thanks, Mike. There are a couple more questions. I wonder if we can get to them. We stopped passing the plate in worship. Our finances are steady and strong. We have a box in the narthex. Should we go back to passing the plate?
You know, once upon a time, we used to just slaughter animals on the altar, and I'm glad we moved beyond that practice. So I like passing the plate. At the same time, it's not the way everybody has to give. I think there should be a way. Well, first off, I do like the offerings being blessed at the offertory. I think that's a nice step in worship to connect our worship with our giving. And so I would bring the box forward at that time right before communion. So I would do that. Whether the box is in the narthex or in the aisleway or where it is, that doesn't matter to me. If it's working for you, great. But then I would also encourage, you know, okay, we used to slaughter animals. We don't do that anymore. We used to pass the plates. We're not doing that. We've replaced it with a box in the narthex. But what might be the next thing? And maybe it's a QR code in your bulletin. Maybe it's you know, an email link emailed to everybody before worship. Maybe somebody's monitoring the chat of your online worship, and at the time of the offering in the chat puts in a link to your giving page on your website. I think we need to make sure that, you know, the purpose of passing the plate was that everybody gets an opportunity to give. Let's make sure we're still giving that opportunity. Yeah, that's good.
Thanks, Mike. I know we're at time at the end. We have one question. I don't know if we have maybe 60 seconds to answer this. And the question is about timing of communication on stories. Do you have some give their testimony quarterly or during offering part of service or after worship? When do you get this? When do you get or give testimony?
So very contextual question. It's got to be what works for you. I would love for a testimony type outcome to be in worship at least quarterly. I would love for those outcomes to be shared more frequently in other contexts as well. But yes, I want it in worship at least quarterly. Otherwise, it's totally separated and people don't see it as part of the worship experience. And I think it is part of the worship experience. So I think quarterly in worship at the minimum. In other contexts, I would like to see 2 outcome stories intentionally told per month, whether that's written or recorded and put on Facebook or whatever it might be, or at Temple Talk or in some way. So.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks. This is a great session. Very useful. As a reminder, you get a recording of this session in a couple of weeks in your inbox.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mike. All right, I'm going to end the session. Thank you for joining us, and the next one starts pretty soon. So get yourself a little break. All right. Bye-bye.